Thank you. Are we ready to get started today? Awesome. Gil, do you have any opening words of wisdom before we start?
Wisdom?
Or whatever you choose.
Good morning. Welcome back. And welcome to those who were not with us yesterday. Beautiful North Augusta. I trust that everyone slept well. I slept right through some serious thunderstorms, I hear. I hope everyone is fine, and there was some pretty heavy wind. But we want to have a great day today. Let's clear our minds. We have some great presentations coming, and I encourage everyone to ask any questions. There are no stupid questions. Again, there are no stupid questions. So please ask all questions that may come across, and ask them boldly. Thank you.
I'm looking forward to it. I think we're going to have a lot of questions today because we have a lot going on. Before we get started, let's recap our rules real quick to make sure that we all know how we're going to operate today. I'm going to ask you again to help us adhere to our agenda timeline. Let's stay on topic as we go through our agenda. Please listen to and respect other people's points of views. I'm going to ask that you do participate and ask questions today because we have a lot going on. So make sure that you are paying attention and ready and get all the information you can out of these presenters because they have taken the time to come here and are ready to tell you what they know. When you do make comments, I'm going to ask that you do please use the microphone and state your name and affiliation before speaking. That helps us with accurate minute transcription. Please do not dominate discussions. Maybe ask one or two questions. We'll let it go back around the table, and if we have time, we'll come back. And then please limit your side conversations. For our agenda today, up first, we have a presentation on remediation projects, and then a fun one by the NWTRB on management disposal of DOE SNF. You've all had the links to the reports sent out to you, so I hope you've had a time to review those. At the very least, the SRS chapter and the summary. If you've had a chance to read the entire thing and you understood all of it, then you're doing better than I was, because that was a tough one for me. We'll take a break for lunch after that. We'll go into sonar mapping technology. And then Maxine will give us an update on H-Canyon. We'll take a short break if we need to. SR's archaeology program will come in and give a presentation on what they do on site, and he has some show and tell for you, which is going to be great. And then after that, DHEC will give a program on their ESOP. So are there any questions about the agenda, the meeting rules, or anything else before we get started today? Everybody's pumped up. You're ready? Let's go. Let's start off with Kathy Lewis with SRNS and her remediation projects.
Oh, yeah. Hi, I'm Kathy Lewis. I work for SRNS in the environmental program. I've been working in the environmental program at SRS for 30 years. So I'm going to give you kind of a really high-level overview of the program and where we are and what we've done so far and what's left to do. Just before I start, I want to thank you for the opportunity to share this. I'm really proud of a lot of work we've done, so this is a nice opportunity for me. And actually having this job has been a really good opportunity for me because I believe it was the very first Earth Day occurred when I was in 7th grade, and I was part of a school project to go out and clean up roadways, and we learned all about environmental issues and what we could do to clean up the world. And I was inspired by that, and I ended up getting degrees in geology, and I've been really happy to have a career in environmental cleanup. So, acronym list, if you get the package. I tried to go through and make sure that there was hardly any acronyms, but you can refer to this. SRS cleanup started in the late 1980s. Then the federal facility agreement, where we decided what were the waste sites and what we were going to do, what were the rules for cleaning them up, was signed in 1993, and that's an agreement between DOE, US EPA, and South Carolina DHEC. There are 515 waste sites that were identified for cleanup, and currently we've cleaned up 408 of those. And in terms of land mass, we have cleaned up 85% of the footprint of SRS. It's not including groundwater. There's a good bit of groundwater. I'm going to talk about that later. We first started out with our 515 waste sites and a whole bunch of D&D sites. I don't even know how many there are. Cleaning them up one by one, following the whole process, characterizing it, figuring out if there was any risk associated with it, figuring out how to clean it up. And it's just a whole bunch of them. And we were doing them one at a time, and it was sort of overwhelming. And we were learning. So 10 years ago or so, we came up upon the idea of closure areas, because we realized that a lot of these waste sites and D&D units were like clustered together, like where the activities had been, where the industrial activities, there were spill sites and contaminated roadways or different patches of ground where things had happened and spilled on the ground that needed to be investigated, and tanks and seepage basins and such. And so they were kind of clustered together, so we came up on the idea of being more efficient about how we did things, and we came up with the idea of closing areas. So we did a bunch of different areas, and I'm just going to give you an overview of the P reactor area. You can see in the top there, top left, there's a big facility, lots of little ancillary and infrastructure associated with it, roadways and railroad tracks and ash piles, just all kinds of stuff, because these industrial areas were kind of like little cities almost. No residents, but all this infrastructure. So we decided to clean it all up at one time instead of, all these individual sites. And then there's just some pictures. We had to think about what we were going to do with the reactor buildings. We'd been mainly doing soil and groundwater cleanup, and now we have these big cement facilities to clean up. Working together with the engineers in D&D. So you can see one of the things that we did was there's a stack implosion where we actually took down parts of the buildings that, as they would age, might fall apart and collapse to try and make them more safer and make it a better end state for leaving the reactor when we were done. Same thing, you see the reactor disassembly basin, knocking down the actual building around the facility to lower the footprint and make it more manageable. And then in the end, you can see at the bottom, we have much reduced a lot of the everything, all the bits and pieces around it, and then the facility doesn't have a lot of stuff hanging off of it and spikes and stuff. It's all try to be neat and clean and make it so no one can get in there. Inside the building, a lot of what we did, we took things out of the building, but a lot of the facility itself is contaminated with radionuclides that would last for thousands of years and tens of thousands of years. And so it was determined that the safest thing to do was basically to just entomb it. And so here's a couple of pictures of us flowing grout into the lower reaches of the reactor building. And this is the reactor seepage basin, disassembly basin, sorry, on the right. Specially formulated grout that we worked with the laboratory to come up with one that wouldn't degrade and that would flow well and it would fill up all the places and that it would help encapsulate the remaining radioactive contamination that's in the building. So this is a schematic of what we've done. On the top left there, you can see a schematic of the reactor building. The red box is the reactor vessel, and then the blue over here is the disassembly basin that was highly contaminated. And then afterwards, the gray shows all the areas where it was filled with this grout, so that we've just left all this contamination entombed in place, and this is in situ decontamination. And it was determined to make the most sense besides trying to break up all this stuff, and workers would be exposed, and we'd have to truck it somewhere, transport it on the roadways. What were we going to do with it once we broke it down and moved it? So we decided the safest thing was to leave it in place. And there's another shot of P-reactor seepage basin. And you'll see that picture again later when we talk about caps, because that's a cap over the ash basin there. Okay, so that's big picture. We went in and tried to make things on the surface, put them in a safe mode. The main thing you have to do is you want to keep people and animals, the ecosystem out. And you want to also protect the environment because you can keep people out of the buildings, but, you close them up so they can't get in there and stuff, and tomb them. But one of the main things that we try to do is protect the underlying earth, the vadose zone, the soil zone that's above the water table, and then the groundwater that's below the water table. And so this is just a generic conceptual model, kind of like a textbook of what's going on, how your environment gets contaminated, and what we can, and then helps us figure out what to do about it. So you have a source, a building or a seepage pond or a rubble pile, whatever it is, and it's got contamination in it. When groundwater, rainwater comes down, it brings the contamination down to the soil zone below that area, and then it gets to the water table and it gets in the groundwater, and then the groundwater moves and the contamination moves. And in general, what you see is that contamination is in the soil zone directly below and beside your source, but that groundwater flows from underneath. The contaminated zone of groundwater is underneath and in a plume, and the plumes tend to go from wherever your facility is to the closest stream. So you got your groundwater coming out and flowing towards streams. And that's just general hydrology. That's the the water cycle that we all learned about in school. So our challenge then for cleanup is to stop this initial source from getting into the groundwater, either by blocking it off somehow with a cap, or excavating it and moving it away and putting it in treating it or put it in a disposal facility. And then to try to mitigate what's already in the soil, because that's still potential to move down into the groundwater, and then to try to clean up what's in the groundwater. And it's a lot faster to deal with the source. It's taking a lot more time to clean up the environmental media. And so a lot of our program is involved in doing that. Okay, so this is a little kind of picture that we like to use for how we think about treating and cleaning up a contaminated site. You got your source, your waste site or whatever it is, and then you have your source zone right around it where you have your highest concentrations of contaminants. And then moving out in the groundwater plume, you've got this primary plume where you'll have like higher concentrations of contaminants. And then at the fringes of the plume, because it's diffusing out as it moves, you get this dilute fringe where you have lower concentrations of contaminants. So at your source zone, you're going to want to try to do your most active remediation. You're going to really want to do something that gives you a lot of bang for your buck, that removes a lot of contamination, a lot of source. So that's where generally your highest cost actions are, right at the source. And then as you're going into lower concentration zones, we try to work on kind of less robust, more creative, working with nature kind of ways to address this huge amount of area, huge volume of contaminated media in a way that's cost effective and also will get us where we want to go. Oh, wrong button. Okay, so another big picture of the SRS here. The pink areas show where we have groundwater contamination. So they tend to be associated with the industrial areas because that's where we would have the seepage ponds and a lot of the waste sites. The largest one is up here in the AM area. That's a huge plume of volatile organics, TCE and PCE. And we've got a lot of activity going on in that area, and I'll get to that. In the general separations area, where the burial ground and the F&H areas are, we've got VOCs in the groundwater, and also a lot of tritium is a primary contaminant in that area. This little plume is from the sanitary landfill, and that's also a smaller plume of lower concentrations of volatile organic compounds. And in the reactor areas, we see TCE and PCE and tritium. These are the most pervasive contaminants across the site in the groundwater. They're mobile. Once they get into the groundwater, they flow. So that's where a lot of our activity is centered on, trying to deal with those contaminants. And then in T area and D area, we've got radionuclides and metals contamination and some VOCs. So we got a big, huge area of land. A small percentage of it is covered, is underlain by plumes of groundwater contamination. But it's still a lot of water out there to be cleaned, that we're working on cleaning up. Okay, so in the source zone, we do the most robust things. We do excavation, soil stabilization, where we're like grouting stuff in place. Put low permeability covers. We use thermal technologies where we try to burn off things if we can. And then we will use chemical oxidation and soil vapor extraction, where we try to vacuum the TC and PC out of the ground. So this is an example, some pictures of excavation that we did at the C area at the railroad tracks. So excavation is the most robust of all, right? You just go in there and you dig the stuff up and you containerize it and you send it to either a treatment or a disposal facility somewhere else. So because you're just moving a ton of stuff, and it's most effective and most cost effective to do this in small areas where you have a defined small space of contamination, and you can just dig it up and send it off to a treatment, and then worry about the lower concentration stuff surrounding it. And so here's an example of the railroad tracks there, and you can see the area is quite small when they're done. That's the area that was excavated, but actually getting people out there, digging up the contaminated soil, using heavy equipment. So this is one of the most robust. And we've done excavation in a good number of places. The reactor seepage basins, we did stabilization of radioactively contaminated soil. So these basins were dug, and then wastewater from the reactors was put into these basins to contain it, so that it wasn't, people weren't coming into contact with it. At the time, this was a standard waste management practice, and people didn't really understand that this would ultimately get into the groundwater. It was just considered a safe way to contain the waste. So now, years later, when we go back in to clean up, we have this highly contaminated radioactive soil at the bottom of these basins. So we use this stabilization, radioactively contaminated soil, use these big auger machines. We use different pieces of equipment at different sites, depending upon the specifics of the situation, but basically using grout to basically make a giant cement block of the ground that was really contaminated, so that, and then covering it up with a low permeability cover, basically to keep the contamination in place in the ground there, so that it does no further contamination of the soil and the groundwater underneath. We use low permeability caps extensively, and here's just some examples of different types of the capping material. So the concept of a low permeability cap is, if you remember my conceptual model, the rain comes down and it rains on your waste site and it carries the contamination into the soil and the groundwater underneath. Well, if you're not going to dig stuff up, you got to at least make sure that the rain doesn't rain through it to bring the contamination into the underlying areas. And so low permeability caps work really well because they shed off the water, and then that contains the contamination in place. And you can see they've got this geotextile membrane that sheds the water and protects the waste site. And here's a couple more pictures of different types, people putting down the membrane. But you got your contaminated soil layer here, then covered with some kind of sandy fill, and then you got these separate layers where to keep the water from flowing through. It's diverted off by these low permeability layers, and then there's drainage layers built in to help funnel the water off of the top. And then all that's just covered up with more fill and a soil level, and then vegetation on top. So these caps are graded. They're not flat. If you go out and look at the site, you'll see they're like mounded, and that helps with keep the rainwater flowing off the sides. And then we maintain these covers by keeping that basically grass layer on top, because you don't want any trees or things with big roots to grow and go down and mess up your layer that's buried under the ground there. So we grow grass on the top and maintain the grass just like you would a yard. And there's an example of a cap just being finished out at P area. And so when you're done, what you see is a nice, clear field, sort of a dome usually, with grass on it. Okay, so another thing that we do in the source areas where contamination is the highest is thermal remediation. And for VOCs, they're volatile organic compounds, which means that they will volatilize into the atmosphere on their own, but heating up really accelerates the process. The same way that water will evaporate, but if you boil a pot of water, it evaporates really quickly. Same exact thing here. You see, apply heat to the system, you get the volatile organic compounds to volatilize. So this is an example in the AM area where we have our biggest plume on site of volatile organic compounds, and they put this whole structure together to inject steam into the underground to volatilize these contaminants. And 500,000 pounds of VOCs were removed from the subsurface and M area doing that. In smaller areas where we have a smaller size unit area of contamination, we've used electrical resistance heating, and we've done that in a couple of places. And that's basically, instead of injecting steam, you put electrodes into the ground and you just heat the ground and you get the same result. And sort of like a toaster. And the ground acts like how the toaster gets hot, resistance in the layers. You can see it burning, you can see it glowing red in your toaster, and then that toasts your bread. Well, the ground acts like a resistor, and it heats up, and it heats the contamination and gets it to volatilize. Okay, so for the dynamic underground stripping, we've done this in 2 separate deployments in 2 areas close to each other in AM area. We inject the steam into the subsurface, and then we extract and treat the water and vapor. So there's the picture of what it looked like from the air. This is a picture of Dean apple. This is dense, non-aqueous phase liquid DNAPL. So this is like pure product TCE, PCE with a bunch in a laboratory, this stuff is clear. It looks kind of like, grain alcohol or something. But in the subsurface, it's full of impurities. And so it turns black like this. But this stuff is sticky and thick, and it doesn't volatilize as easily as when it's, most plumes, it's dissolved into the water. This is not dissolved, it's actually sitting, it's denser than water and it sinks and it'll sit on the top of like a clay layer. It's really hard to get it out of the ground. And so steaming it is one way to get it to mobilize. So you inject the steam into the subsurface. This is a well, a conceptual well here. And you push the steam into the contaminated zone, and this heats it up and volatilizes the DNAPL that was just sitting there and resisting being extracted by regular pump and treat and soil vapor extraction. And then bring it up in an extraction well and treat it. And this is my toaster example, the electrical resistance heating. You can see the, whoop, what did I do? Push the wrong button. You can see there's wells and then electrodes where heating up the ground around this waste site here. And this is a shot of it in sea area. It's very, very successful. We do this for a couple of months, and then we go in and take a sample, and 99% of the VOCs are gone. So works really well. It's an expensive proposition. Putting electricity into the ground is dangerous. Anytime you deal with electricity, it's kind of dangerous. So there's lots of controls in place, and uses a lot of power. So we only use it in areas where we think it's worth the bang for the buck. This is another example of thermal cleanup that we did in D area, and this is actually for tritium. We had all this soil and rubble from a building that was contaminated with high levels of tritium. And tritium is kind of contaminated water. It acts very much like water. And so it's very hard to treat chemically or physically because it really just acts like water. So what they did was they piled all the stuff into a little house thing that they built out of concrete blocks, and they put a roof on it to contain the heat, and then used electrical heating elements, again just heating it up like the toaster, to drive the tritium from the contaminated concrete and soil, because it's in the form of water that's in the pore space in those contaminants, and so heat it up, evaporate it. Okay. I've alluded to soil vapor extraction. So this is another source area one that's often used. This is a go-to cleanup for VOCs in the vadose zone above the groundwater, where you have contamination with TCE and PCE primarily in the vadose zone. And it's kind of just stuck there, and gravity's dragging it down towards the water, and you don't really want it to get in the water because it's the hardest of all to clean it up once it gets in the groundwater. So we try to intercept it in that vadose zone under the waste site and before it gets to the groundwater. And basically, soil vapor extractions are big vacuum cleaners. And these are just examples, photographs of different ones that we have set up around the site. And basically, it's got pumps and condensers, big engineering thing, it needs electrical power. Sometimes you can run small ones on diesel, but you need to, use a lot of power and engineer this thing. But basically, you vacuum and if you have enough contamination, you'll even need a catalytic converter. But you basically pump this volatile organics out of the vadose zone. And here's an example of a well that's going down into the ground, and you can just see the piping coming up, and it's leading off into one of these kind of units here. And this is an example I think this is at CMP pits, where we have a lot of contamination in that one area right below the waste site. Well, we have a whole bunch of wells, and so you can see the area is just populated with the wells. So we hook them all up to the big blower system and pump that stuff out of the ground. Sometimes soil vapor extraction is not enough. Those DNAPLs and even just regular TC and PC have an affinity for clay zones, really tight layers. Sandy units, you can pump it out just with vacuum relatively easily, but it wants to stick onto clays. So it's hard, you know, you keep pumping the air out, but not in, you know there's contamination down there, but you know you're not getting it all. So one of the things that we do is fracturing. And you know, this is borrowed from the oil and gas industry. You hear about fracturing and fracking, and they go in there and they break up the rock so they can get the oil and gas out. And of course, there's a lot of issues with that. But we're using that same technology, but you know, instead of doing it deep in the earth, we're doing it at like, you know, 30 feet or 50 feet, or so. It's relatively shallow. And so use a high pressure jet that basically just water fracking the tight layers up, and then pump in this guar sand slurry into the fractures to keep them open with sandy stuff so that we can, this is just a conceptual picture showing how we've now injected these sandy layers into an area where we're having a hard time getting the contamination out. And so we've been, you know, that really helps sometimes when your SBE system is stuck. But a lot of times, we started with SBE on almost all of these, and then we went to the thermal when we realized SBE wasn't getting it. So, you know, try fracking it, we'll try heating it, you know, just we keep trying to think of ways to improve the system to get the stuff out of there. So that's kind of the universe of stuff that we do in the source area. You can dig it up, you can contain it in place, you can suck it out with a vacuum, you can heat it up to make it easier to suck it out with a vacuum, you can break it up to make it easier to suck out with a vacuum. These are all like really, you know, when you think about it, they're all really kind of common sense activities, but that's what we have. Then we go to the primary plume. Now this is after your contamination got away from you and it's already in the ground and you got to try and clean it up. So in the primary plume area, we have, you know, pretty high levels of concentrations of contaminants we need to get out of the ground. So robust measures are called for. So a lot of times what we use is pump and treat. You put wells in the ground and you pump the water out and you run it through a water treatment system. What that does, it removes mass, but a lot of what it does is it helps keep the plume from expanding further, right? Because as long as you're sucking it in, it's not migrating away, or at least not as quickly. So that's like a hydraulic control kind of activity. We also can use barrier walls to control a plume and where it's going. And we also have a phyto-remediation pond project, and I'll show you these in the next couple of slides. Different ways that we try to control the flow of water so that the contamination doesn't spread, or at least slow down the spread while we're trying to clean it up. And then we have in situ measures where instead of trying to control the flow of the plume, we're actually injecting things into the subsurface to attempt to clean up the groundwater in place instead of pumping it out of the ground. Because the whole pumping it out of the ground thing is super inefficient. It's very, very expensive. You have to build facilities and have operators, and things break, and you create waste. You use lots of energy. It's called for sometimes, you gotta do it, but you know, there's probably better ways to do stuff a lot of times. And so we're looking to try and do things in situ, in place. And usually that means squirting stuff in the ground. And you know, you can squirt in chemical oxidation, you put in oxidants, and then they react with the volatile organic compounds and break them down. And we've had a lot of luck with nutrient injection to enhance bioremediation. Everywhere in the world, under the ground, on top of the ground, in your soil, in your body, there's these microbes, right? And they live there naturally. So some of them like to eat our contamination. And so we try to figure out which ones we have there that will eat our contamination, and then we feed them. Because if you increase the population of bugs that naturally break down your contaminants, then they eat it up faster, and you can clean up the area more successfully. So we've had a lot of luck with that, actually, because it's a natural process. And so one thing we've figured out by doing this is that anything you can do that works with nature instead of tries to oppose nature works a lot better. Okay, so this is the M1 air stripper. This is the only operating air stripper that we have at SRS. Currently, it went into service in the 1980s, and it's working to do hydraulic control on the big plume in the AM area. And even though it's been there a long time, it's not like we just turn it on and let it go. These are recent pictures from the last couple of months, where we're actually installing new wells that extract the contamination and then run it to the air stripper, where the VOCs are stripped from the water and released into the atmosphere. What we found was that we were so successful in removing mass from the plume with the existing pump and treat system that's been going on for over 20 years, that we had reduced the area that it was targeting so that that was no longer the highest concentration zone. And we realized, well, now the highest concentration zone is actually in this part we missed, because we haven't captured everything. We just tried to capture the most contaminated part. So we actually are redesigning the system to try to capture the most contaminated parts, and we're discontinuing use of some of the wells in areas that have been relatively cleaned up, and then we're putting new holes in the ground to chase the higher concentration zones. So it's a continuing effort. Phyro-remediation collection pond is a really neat technology. So at the old rad waste burial ground, we call that the Southwest Plume. Plume of mostly tritium coming out, and it was discharging in a plume and getting into 4 Mile Branch, which then flows into the Savannah River. So concentrations of tritium were quite high, and so we were like, we need to do something to stop this. Tritium isn't something you can pump up and treat because it acts like water, so it's really hard to actually treat it, so we had to do a hydraulic control project. So what we did was, there was a little unnamed tributary where a bunch of the water was flowing into this little tributary, and that was flowing into 4 Mile Branch. So we realized, well, all the contamination's like naturally flowing in, because remember, that's how my little conceptual model showed the water flows into the nearest stream. Well, it was all flowing into this little stream. So we were like, well, we're just going to dam it up. And so they basically made a farm pond and put sheet pile dam in and collected all this water behind it that had been in this little creek that ran into 4 Mile Branch. And this is a picture from the air. There's the dam right here, and here's the pond that's been built up in here. Now, the whole thing with building a wall to hold back water, it's just like any dam. You can't just build a wall and it forever holds back the water, because the water's going to go build up behind it, and it's going to go around it or under it or over it, because the water just keeps coming. So, in the hydroelectric dams, they have spillways and they let water out and all that to manage it. But we don't want to do that, because we don't want the contamination to get out into the creek. That's what we're trying to do, is stop that. So what we're doing then instead is we're applying, wrong picture. we're applying it, irrigating the pine forest here. These are like irrigation pipes. So the water that's collected behind the pond then is pumped out and then used to water these pine trees in the surrounding forest. And the pine trees are growing on top of the plume that's already contaminated. So we're not spreading the contamination, we're just keeping it out of the creek in the time being. And then also we spray the water and try to evaporate it using like the snowblower kind of machine, snowmaker kind of machine to like just get it to evaporate into the atmosphere. So this has been very successful because this is a little graph over time, and it shows before we built the dam, we had concentrations of tritium up here at this high level. Then they built the dam and it went right down. And it stayed really low. Then we shut down, we opened up the dam for a little while to do maintenance. We've decided we need to fix some stuff and make it more efficient and just basic, all things need maintenance, you know. So we opened up the dam and concentrations went up high again. And then we finished the maintenance and went back into regular operations. And you can see that the concentrations of tritium in 4 Mile Branch have gone down significantly. So this is something we call an enhanced natural system because we're using a lot of natural systems here. We're letting nature collect the water for us. We're just put a dam in so that we can get it out before it gets to the creek. But we're not pumping the water there. We're letting nature put the water there. And then we're using the natural system of transpiration with the pine trees because we're watering the trees with this water, and then this water that has tritium in it is taken up into the pine trees and released into the atmosphere. So we're kind of leveraging the natural system that's already there to help us do cleanup. Okay, another thing we did to protect 4 Mile Branch from tritium is to use subsurface barrier walls. So this is another hydraulic control thing where we have tritium in the groundwater and we can't just pump it up and treat it, so we got to figure out a way to redirect it so that it's not going out into the creek, which is flowing into the Savannah River. So here's a little map here. This is the F seepage basin, which the burial ground on this map would be over here. So you know the plume with the phytopond's like over here somewhere. But this one was a similar plume of mostly tritium going down and discharging into 4 Mile Branch, which is down here. What we noticed from doing, you know, taking lots of samples, putting in wells and monitoring them regularly and trying to map where is the plume, what's it doing, how deep is it, how far away is it, all that. We noticed that they were like main areas of the plume that had high concentrations, and then intervening areas that had lower. And it's all got to do with, you know, the little flow pathways, that the underlying geology, and also the shortest distance to the stream and the wetlands. But so since we identified this and we could map it, we thought, well, we can use this to our benefit. So we installed a barrier system. Now up here is like a little conceptual cross-section of something like goes across here. So what we saw in the subsurface is that the tritium the plume was preferentially flowing in these old stream channels. Because, you know, the way that geology works is that you have erosion and deposition, and everybody knows what a stream channel looks like, right? You got, you know, the cut downs on the sides and then a sandy bottom. Well, over time, you know, this gets filled in with stuff over the top, you know, in geologic time, and you're left with these structures under the ground. And so what we've seen here are these old stream beds, and they have a lot more sand, and this is a lot more clayey. Because, you know, when you think about it, when you're like stomping around in a stream, getting your feet wet, the bottom is all sandy and the sides are all red clay. So we see this under the ground, and water flows really quickly through sand, but not so much through clay. You know, like if you have a swimming pool and you have a sand filter, you use the water can flow through the sand relatively well. But you know, I don't think we do this too much anymore, but in years past, they would use vitrified clay pipes to transport water and sewerage under cities because clay doesn't allow water to flow through it really easily. So, you know, we sort of have a little natural funnel system here where the groundwater that's now contaminated with tritium is flowing in these sandy old stream channel zones. And up here, you know, it's not as contaminated. So we're like, okay, well, we know where the contamination is. Let's just put a wall there. So we did. And so we used this big machine here to install these subsurface barriers that basically just more grout. We're big on grout, you know. You just mix up this cement grout stuff with the existing soil, and then when it hardens, you got a wall. And, you know, we had the lab people tell us the chemistry of the wall so that it wouldn't you know, chemically react with the undersurface and all that. So now we have these walls here blocking off the highest concentration pathways. But again, you know, if you just build a wall, the water will go over it and under it and around it, and you're just slowing down the problem temporarily, but it'll catch up with you. So you still have to do something to manage the water. So what we did to manage the water is to leave these gates here in the areas where the concentrations aren't as high. And what that does is it forces the water to go through the gates. But, you know, most of the contamination is stuck down here in these stream channels that are cut off. So the water is forced to go through these gates up here in the shallower zone between the walls. And so it cuts down on the tritium, getting a foam oil branch, and it gives us a place where we can do in situ treatment because tritium is our biggest problem, but we also have some other, we have metals in there, and we had a low pH plume. So we do base injection because, you know, you have acid and base, and so if you have an acidic plume and you want your groundwater to go back to natural situation, then you inject some base to try and make it become more natural. Same thing is like, you know, liming your yard. You know, you want to change the pH of the soil so that it's more conducive to grass to grow. So, so we're doing the same thing, same basic, simple chemistry, injecting base into the gates. So as the water flows through the gates, then it's treated by an influx of base that will bring the pH back to a more normal concentration. And so a lot of the metals in the plume weren't really even from the waste. They were from the subsurface minerals that had been dissolved by all the acid. So then when you put the pH back to a normal pH, a lot of those drop back out of solution and you get a more natural, normal groundwater characteristic. So, and then this is a picture of some people around the tank that holds the water in the base solution, and a picture of the unit that we use to, you know, monitor what we're putting in the ground and making sure it's working well. So this is just another example of us attempting to go with nature, right? Try to restore things to a natural balance instead of, you know, try to suck everything out of the ground and fix it that way. It's like, well, how can we help, you know, nature? How can we nudge it in the right direction? And, okay, I'm sorry. I didn't realize I'd be so slow. Okay, silver chloride. One of the other things we saw in this F&H plume is silver chloride. Oh, yeah, 3 minutes. And it is iodine 129, which is a radionuclide contaminating the groundwater that changing the pH of the water didn't help. So we're just going ahead and injecting silver chloride, and this is just a picture of what silver chloride looks like before you would put it in the ground, and then after it reacts with the iodine, it actually chemically binds it up. So, you know, also using the gate system. Bioremediation, this is where we've done this at a bunch of different sites where we're feeding the bugs. Very simple picture of the, you know, it's on a truck. Mix up the solution of bug food, squirt it into the ground, and this is 2 pictures of a plume, the plume before oil injection at T area, and then the plume after. Significantly reduced. And we've gone back in actually since this data, and we've done another dose of injection to try to get the, you know, the last bits that are still there. Okay, depleted source areas. That's where we've mainly got everything out, but there's still some stuff. We're going to microblowers. This is a solar-powered soil vapor extraction. I showed you all those big soil vapor extraction things. Well, here, we're using solar-powered on individual wells. And you can see the size of them. There's a man standing there and how small the unit is. No power. So, you know, we're moving towards a more passive thing here. I hate to blow through this because I like this part. But we also use barometric pressure to vent out low amounts of VOCs that remain in the subsurface. So turn off all the equipment and just use this little contraption that basically leverages barometric pressure to move some of the VOCs out of the vadose zone. It's just a little plastic thing. Sometimes people drive over them. That's about the only thing that ever goes wrong with them. You know, we have to fix them. And in the diluted ends of the plumes, or a plume that's mainly been cleaned up, but it's still not really clean, we do monitor natural attenuation, which essentially is, you know, we're almost there. Let's just keep monitoring it, make sure we didn't miss something. And, you know, if we did, we'll go back and get it. But, you know, maybe it's okay if we just watch it go away on its own. And there's just a bunch of pictures of people doing different kinds of monitoring. So, 0. I'm almost done. So this is the story, really, that I didn't spend enough time telling you. In the beginning of the program, everything was active. It was all like bulldozers and pumps and big, giant pieces of machinery. And as the program matures, we're shutting those down, and we're moving to more passive stuff, more environmentally friendly, the enhanced natural systems, so that now we've got 4 big SBE systems and 1 airstripper running, and everything else is some kind of work with nature, natural passive system. And, you know, we only think that will continue to the future as we get the place cleaned up. Very soon, we'll be doing work at, we're looking at doing a reactive barrier in P area to clean up a plume in the P area. We think we'll be injecting iron oxides into the groundwater that will interact chemically with the TCE and break it down. Bunch of injections, more edible oil injection, that's the macronutrients, nutrients, some oxidant injection, and more microbial stuff with humate injection. So you may be seeing that. I don't know if the cab sees our stuff or not. And then upcoming decisions, we're working on cleaning up lower 3 runs, a big canal system that has contaminated sediments. And D groundwater is coming up soon, and G oil seepage basin. This is a picture of it, what we're going to do to clean that up. D groundwater, that's for another day. And so long term, we have lots of work to do in M area with that big VOC plume. F and H area work continues with the barriers and the injection. And the phyto pond, we need to keep monitoring. We need to keep that going until the tritium decays. And then lots and lots of long-term monitoring. in the future, what do we have left to do? We've done a lot, but we haven't done them all yet. There's a bunch of ash projects that we have to work on. We haven't even started really on N area groundwater and K area groundwater, and there's a few areas out there we still need to do. Collaboration, this is what we learned. Collaboration breeds innovation. Working with the regulators, working with the lab, working with stakeholders really led us to a lot of these natural kind of solutions and doing things a smart way. Robust source control. Sometimes you just gotta dig it up. Sometimes you just have to do something massive like dynamic underground stripping. You just need to get like that huge amount of mass out of the ground, because as long as it stays there, it's gonna fester and create more problems. But once you do that, working with nature is the way to go. So this is our history. We started out active, we leveraging natural processes, we're going more and more passive and more natural. That's my last slide, and I'm only 2 minutes over.
What do we got for questions? Let's start with Narendra.
Narendra Malik, CAB. I have millions of questions, but I'll ask you 2 questions.
Okay.
One is, when you apply thermal technology, is there any emission of chemicals and you monitor them?
The thermal technology?
Yes.
Yeah, we monitor like crazy, but we're usually looking for you know, is it working? So we're focusing on the VOCs, you know, what do we have first, and then what's left later. But we do monitor for lots of things while we're doing it, because we have to keep control of the process, and we don't want to have any unintended consequences. So we generally have a very robust monitoring program, and that'll be, you know, reviewed by the regulators, and, you know, they'll, generally speaking, they'll add more things in there that we didn't think of.
And what is the success story of recovery of DNAPL, since it's a nasty material?
What is what?
Nasty material, DNAPLs.
Yeah. What about DNAPL?
What's the recovery success?
Oh, it hasn't all been removed. No, we're still working on it. As a matter of fact, western sector is a portion of the plume that, you know, the plume sort of looks like 3 things coming out at you. Well, this side over here, we're just getting to it, because we can only do so much at one time. And as we're doing stuff, we learn. So, yeah, we are still chasing DNAPL, but it's hard to find because things that dissolve in the groundwater are relatively easy to track where they are, because you know which way the groundwater flows, and so you just, you know, you figure out where the edge is. But DNAPL, it's dense and it doesn't flow with the water necessarily. It rolls downhill, so you got the flow of the water, but that's superimposed upon the geology under the ground. And so, you know, we have like a clay and a bunch of sand, and then a clay, and then another clay. Well, that DNAPL will do like a pinball game. It'll come down and hit this one, and then slide off, and then hit this one, and then slide that way. And so, you know, it's hard to know when you got it all.
And my final question is, when you grout the parts of the reactor, do you monitor, continuous monitor, or have a schedule for monitoring the radioactivities?
Yes, there is a inspection schedule, and for all CERCLA stuff, and they were done under CERCLA ROD, there's a 5-year remedy review where I mean, this is a requirement under the law that you have to do for all of them, and, you know, and we spend a lot of energy on it. You have to evaluate whether anything has changed, whether there's any new regulations that, you know, need to be taken into account that weren't taken into account when you did this, and then is the remedy working? And so the inspections and monitoring are a big part of that. And we recently actually started using a drone to do some of the monitoring of the roof of the reactor building because it's hard to see. So, yeah, inspection and maintenance is a big part of our program now.
Let's just go around clockwise. So, Joyce.
Joyce Underwood, Cab. Okay, so slide 10, you talked about the groundwater plumes, the map.
Oh, yeah.
And the map shows all these little streams and tributaries and whatnot. Is there like a rate of contamination? Like, because obviously the way it is now, especially with A area, is like overlapping a stream, and I'm assuming that the stream feeds into the Savannah River.
Right.
So can you like track how quickly it's going to get
Right.
there?
We actually spend a lot of energy trying to figure this out. So in some places, we're already impacting streams, like I was explaining about the tritium and 4 Mile. In AM area, we're not really impacting the streams yet, but the plumes are definitely approaching there, but at low concentrations. And so that's what all this hydraulic control is about, trying to keep that from happening. There's other areas on site where we do have contamination entering streams. And the P area I was talking about, that's coming up soon. We have a plume of volatile organic compounds that's about entering into that Steel Creek up there. And so we're attempting to do a mitigation of that by doing an in situ. So, yeah, you know, everything's not perfect. We're working on it.
So it doesn't move at a constant rate towards the stream, is what you're saying?
Oh, groundwater flow rate?
Well, I guess.
Yeah, yeah. 100 foot per year is probably a pretty good general guesstimate.
Okay, and what's the rate like once it gets in the stream to get to the river? Do you know that?
What?
The rate once it gets in the stream to trickle into the river?
Bam!
Oh, immediately? Okay, okay, good. Not good, but you know, that answered my question. And I had another, it's probably really quick and stupid question. The other slide about the buildings, slide 7, that you put the grout in. Can you use the rest of the building once you've done that, or is it just
No.
touchy?
The building is shut down,
Okay.
completely closed. D&D. It's shut so that you can't get in there. They've like welded the doors shut, and it's entombed.
Okay, thank you.
Is this Charles or Susan down at the end? Susan?
Susan Corwitt, Cab. Thank you for being so passionate for cleaning up the environment. We really appreciate your energy and your passion.
Thanks.
I have a lot of questions, but I think under the new format, we're going to be discussing this as the next committee meetings. Is that correct, the way I understand this? I think we'll have time to discuss this more. Okay. Just a couple things. So once we entomb these reactors with this grout, eventually the grout itself becomes radioactive, I'm assuming, right? Because it's just a porous cement material and it will absorb radiation, correct?
To some extent, the radionuclides will migrate through a cementatious material.
Okay.
Not really quickly, but yes.
And I've asked this question before, and I'm not sure, maybe because I'm getting old and I can't remember. So this grout, what is the life expectancy? Because, most grout is just, 50 years maybe if we're lucky. Is there a life expectancy? And then what will happen? Will it eventually start to crumble? And then, do we have a modeling on that?
I don't know the life expectancy of the grout. I do know that people worked on trying to come up with the best grout mix with that in mind and the whole integrity of it. Nothing lasts forever, but
except radioactive waste. Except radioactive waste.
Right. Yeah, tens of thousands of years. So, but even if the grout were to crumble and lose its integrity, it's in this big building, and a lot of the thing is just to make it inaccessible so that. It's better if it's a giant cement block, but even if it's a crumbly cement block inside of a big cement monolith, that's probably better than just leaving it how it was.
And then one last question. It sounds like a lot of what we're doing in all these places is kind of getting this stuff out of the ground, but we're releasing it into the air. Is that better? How is that better? I'm confused as to how you're just kind of relocating it
Yeah.
from one place to another.
That is true. In a lot of situations, we are moving the contamination from the groundwater into the air. And when I first came to work here, I was like, really, is that the right answer? But it's a lot less toxic in the air. We have a big air permit for the site, and all the levels are well below the permitted standard, which is, intended to be a safe level. When the VOCs go into the atmosphere, well, there's a huge amount of dilution, which, dilution's not the solution, but sometimes it helps. But also, they tend to break down in the UV light into, and I'm not a chemist, I can't do the chemical equation, but the VOCs tend to break down into innocuous things in the atmosphere, helped along by sunlight. But yeah, a lot of it is going into the atmosphere.
Carlos Cato, CAB. In terms of the groundwater contamination, are there any containment efforts? How do we keep that from contaminating fresh water?
Right now, we're not impinging on any public waters or private water supplies. And one of the main, that's what you're really asking, right? One of the great things that we have in our favor, really, is how big the Savannah River site is. So it's 300 square miles, and most of those those plumes are all contained within that 300 square miles, and most of them are like pretty far from the site boundary. So the main access point for people to come into contact with the constituents in our groundwater contamination is through the stream pathways, where it discharges to a stream, and then the stream runs into the Savannah River. And so that's why we're actively trying to keep that from happening. But if we were had our facility right next to a neighborhood, then that would be a different story. But it's lucky that we have the geographic boundary of having a huge site.
Dave.
Dave Babakis, CAB. Thank you for your presentation. I was looking at one of your earlier slides. It says there's an 85% reduction so far of the SRS EM footprint. I had noted at some point that all the SRS areas were expected to be environmentally cleaned up and the facility decommissioned by FY 2031. But then I see one of your slides taking it out to 2050. What's the target?
You know what? I'm not sure what it is right now. I'm technical, and so I don't know. Does somebody else in the room know that number? I'll have to look that up. I don't really know what we're projecting. I know that those numbers get revised. Oh, does somebody know it?
Maxine Maxon. I don't know the exact answer, but what goes into it and why that date changes is based on our funding and when we can actually get facilities deactivated so that they can be turned over and cleaned up. So that's what our life cycle is based on. That life cycle gets updated every year. That's why you're probably seeing different numbers, because those funding numbers get impacted into that.
Thank you.
Thank you. And just one last question. All of the regulation for this cleanup work is done by EPA and DHEC? Is that correct?
Yes, that's right. We sometimes, other oversight groups come and look at us. We had a public health assessment, too, I think, in the last, 10 or 15 years, by the ATSDR. And I actually forgot what that stands for. It's got like Toxic Disease Registry or something in there. But, and they're like associated with the CDC, a government oversight agency that does public health assessments. And so they come in and, go through all of our documents and all of our data. And They did one on the soil contamination and one on groundwater. And in both cases, they determined that right now that we are not, a danger to the public health. I forgot their exact wording that they use. But, that's contingent upon us continuing these efforts.
Larry.
Larry Powell, CAB. All the contaminated areas that you've been talking about, obviously at one time, Savannah River Site was responsible for allowing this contamination to leach into the soil or water system, whatever. What occurred at Savannah River Site to make people say, we've got to quit contaminating the soil and we got to start cleaning it up, and when did that occur?
Well, I think it has to do with Superfund and RECRA, those two main regulations. And I hope I'm saying this right, because that's not my area of expertise. But I know that we do almost all of our cleanup under CERCLA and RECRA. And CERCLA is the Superfund law, and then Resource or RECRA, Conservation and Recovery Act, right? Thank you, somebody out there. Under that law, that's another environmental law, facilities have to be permitted, and so a lot of our cleanup is occurring in post-closure where the facility had a permit and now we're not using the facility anymore, so as part of closure, we have to do environmental cleanup.
Thank you.
All right. Jim.
Jim Gill, CAB. Two questions. Number one, in the remediation process, you have the low permeability cap, which is being used in many locations.
Mm-hmm.
Do we have an estimate as to how long that's going to maintain its integrity?
Well, since we do constant maintenance, I think we're calling it indefinite. We have, that's a big part of our program is the inspection and maintenance of those caps. And one of the main things that you would have might be subsidence and erosion of the cap, because it's all buried under the ground, so it's pretty inert, the part that's buried. You don't want it to become exposed where it would start to erode away. So we have people that's what they do. They go around and they inspect the stuff and they say, oh, we saw, there's die-off over here on the grass. We need to reseed it or put sod there, or there's a slump off on, one of the, that they're built like this, with angles so the water can run off. And so sometimes, water doesn't run off exactly the right way, and then there's like some erosion, and then they'll go and fix it. So I think that as long as we do maintenance on them and keep them in good shape, they should last as long as we do that.
So the intent is to monitor them to make sure they're not losing their impermeability. Okay. Second question, in the collection pond with irrigation process that you're using, the intent of that is to actually recycle the water contaminated with tritium and to evaporate that into the atmosphere at some reasonable rate. And
yes.
That's how we're remediating the tritium that's there?
Right. Well, tritium has a pretty short half-life, so it's not going to last like tens of thousands of years. But, we'll be doing this for a couple hundred probably. But, yeah, that's the intent, is to water the pine forest so that the pine trees can help us evapotranspirate the tritium into the atmosphere.
Okay, thank you.
Doug, you put your card down. Did Jim steal your question, or were you just preemptive? All right, way to go, Jim. All right, well, thank you, Kathy.
Sure. Thank you.
So up next we have Brett Leslie, and he's with the Nuclear Waste Technical Review Board. I'm sure he's going to tell you who they are and what they do. This is an organization independent of the Department of Energy, and he's going to present some information on a report that they recently completed. They came to us in January and asked to present, so I'm really looking forward to hearing what they have to say. With that.
Thanks, James. Before I get into the describing what the report is, I want to give a little bit of background on what the U.S. Nuclear Waste Technical Review Board is. As James indicated, we're an independent federal agency. We're separate from the Department of Energy. We're not the Defense Nuclear Facility Safety Board. And we were set up in 1987 when Congress also identified Yucca Mountain as the sole site to be characterized for geologic disposal. So what is the board's mission? The board was set up by Congress to evaluate the technical and scientific validity of DOE's activities under the Nuclear Waste Policy Act, including activities related to packaging and transportation. Here's 3 figures showing packaging of spent fuel and transporting of high-level radioactive waste or spent nuclear fuel, and also on-site characterization, design, and development of a disposal facility, a repository, in other words. One of the things the board does is it reports its findings and recommendations based on its evaluations of DOE's activities to Congress and the Secretary of Energy. And it also serves as a place where Congress can come to and for advice on nuclear waste disposal activities. So one more thing about the board. The board is a very small independent agency. The board members themselves are nominated by the National Academy of Science solely based upon their eminence and expertise. They are appointed by the president. They serve part-time, staggered terms. And the board is supported by an equal number of staff. So 20% of the entire agency is here today with you. So we're small, but we work hard. So the board, the report was a culmination of a multi-year review focused on kind of looking at where we are in the U.S., continued storage of commercial and defense fuel, spent nuclear fuel, and high-level waste, followed eventually by geologic disposal. And we conducted this review by holding public meetings, and here's the example. We were in Augusta back in October of 2014. Here's Maxine giving us a tour of the L Basin. So we come, we request presentations from the Department of Energy and other interested stakeholders. We tour the facilities. We have one-on-one, really candid conversations with the DOE staffs and the contractors. And then as part of that review, as part of our ongoing review, we provide technical and scientific comments in letters. And so this is an example. In fact, this letter is from January 2015 after our October meeting. So the report itself is just a culmination. We made some recommendations along the way, and what I'm going to talk about now is the board's report. And there were copies out there earlier. There were 10 copies. They're all gone now. If you want copies, see myself after the presentation. We also, because we communicate with Congress, we try to make our information accessible to the public. So we developed a series of fact sheets, and we've put those out there as well on DOE spent fuel, on the fuel at Savannah River site. So there's some fact sheets there. They're all available on the website, which is nwtrb.gov. Here's again, we report to Congress and the Secretary of Energy, and fuel, L Basin, storage, packaging, transportation, and Yucca Mountain. So again, the board looks at things from a very wide perspective and kind of asks itself, how do we get from where the waste is now, Stanford? They didn't have a very good feel for how dry was dry enough. They had done a lot of modeling, so what they did is they built into these multi-purpose canister the capability to monitor things that would tell them how dry the fuel was. So they monitored 15 representative packages for pressure, temperature, and gaseous constituents like oxygen, water vapor, and hydrogen. So the MCO is done and complete. This was not enriched, low enriched uranium fuel. Two others that DOE has. The naval canister, which is used only at Idaho National Lab, and it's used only for the naval fuel. The packaging is ongoing, and they're storing it dry after they unpackage it from their transportation package. I mean, so like the USS Enterprise was defueled recently. That fuel was transported to Idaho. Idaho then the Navy at Idaho then put it into these naval canisters. They're big. They're very heavy. So the last one that DOE had identified, and again, when I say DOE identified this is what is actually in the license application for Yucca Mountain. So, and DOE had started to develop this standardized canister so that it could deploy it. But it never completed the development. So in 2008 to 2010, as Yucca Mountain was shutting down, DOE and Office of Environmental Management shut down the development and deployment of the standardized canister and basically said, well, we don't know which repository it will go, and so we don't know whether this could be used anywhere. And so they basically said the DOE standardized canister is indeterminate, and we're not going to move forward on that. Why is this canister very important? Well, it's for all the remaining DOE non-naval spent fuel, and there's a lot of canisters. So 3,500 canisters is a lot of canisters. It's going to be used at Idaho, it's going to be used at Hanford, and would be used at Savannah River. Again, this is what DOE was projecting it would do. It would package into these multi-purpose canisters, transport it to a repository at Yucca Mountain. As that figure of the different geometries suggests, it's like doing a jigsaw puzzle, and DOE tried to maximize the efficiency of packaging, and so they ended up having not just one DOE standardized canister, it's a canister system. It's got 2 heights, 2 diameters, and one of the more critical things is a lot of the DOE spent fuel is highly enriched. And so in a nuclear power plant, criticality is what you're trying to do. You're trying to generate the electricity. Well, once you take it out of a reactor, that process of criticality is something you don't want to do, and so you want to stop it. And one way of stopping that is under radioactive decay, let's just say this fuel is shooting off neutrons over this way. Well, if you have a material here that absorbs that neutron, that reduces the likelihood of any criticality. So one of the things that DOE had for this standardized canister is an advanced neutron absorber. Again, they had not completed the development of it. It was critical for determining that the package would never go critical in a wrong place. So some of this will not be new, for example, for the members of the Nuclear Materials Committee of this group, but some of it, again, for each site, we put together key observations relative to that site, because there are people at Idaho that care about what's happening at Savannah River. Congress cares about what's happening at Savannah River as well. So these observations are at the back of that chapter, and basically it just says, you know, DOE is constrained by how it manages its spent fuel, and some of those constraints are by decision it makes under the National Environmental Policy Act, including stuff like receiving foreign research reactor fuel, or how much fuel is processed through H Canyon. So at Savannah River, well, this is interesting. Not the latest version when it got to you, but it's all right. I'll talk to it anyway. So at Savannah River, DOE plans to continue safe wet storage, process some of the aluminum-based fuel in H Canyon, indefinitely suspend its decision on the planned exchange of spent fuel with Idaho, and assess the potential for extended dry storage and subsequent transportation and disposal. So one of the things we'll talk about, the fuel at Savannah River includes aluminum-based and non-aluminum-based. Well, back in 1995, when DOE made a decision on how it was going to manage fuel across the complex, Hanford, Idaho, they said they're going to regionalize their spent fuel. So ideally, Savannah River was only going to have aluminum-based fuel, Idaho was going to have all the cats and dogs, and Hanford was going to have the production fuel. So under that agreement in 1995, Idaho and Savannah River were going to exchange fuel. And this indefinite suspension has an impact because the non-aluminum-based fuel can't go through H Canyon. So it's kind of, you know, even if all the aluminum-based fuel went H Canyon, you'd still have some fuel here. Whether DOE continues to whether DOE decides to have this exchange, I think, is still somewhat under contemplation. My understanding is DOE is in the process to develop a strategy for DOE spent fuel. So The L Basin, which you saw a figure of earlier, stores 30 metric tons. It's at near its capacity for different types of fuel, aluminum-based fuel. That's why some of it is going through H Canyon. DOE uses aqueous processing, and Maxine could describe it much more eloquently than I can. But anyway, they use that to assure their adequate storage space there. And as I suggested just a second ago, without a major change to H Canyon, there'll still be 20 metric tons of non-aluminum-based fuel that are stored in L Basin. So one of the observations is that aluminum-based fuels are hard to deal with, and that they're going to be in a lot of the DOE spent fuel canisters. And I'll talk a little bit more about that, but drying aluminum is hard because aluminum has corrosion products on it, and those corrosion products, like rust, have molecules of water. So even though you take this aluminum-based fuel out of a pool and put it into something, and you pull a vacuum on it and pull the water out, you're pulling out the free water. In other words, the water that's drained into the bottom of the package. Well, that rust-like material has water associated with it. And so how do you get that water out? Well, maybe you heat it up. Well, you heat it up too much, then the aluminum kind of loses its structural capability. So there's this kind of recipe that you have to work with, and drying and understanding what that recipe is a critical thing. It's not to say that Savannah River hasn't looked at drying the aluminum-based fuel, but when we looked at the reports that they've done, they did not identify that if they put it into dry storage that these advanced neutron absorber materials would be in it. Well, those advanced neutron absorber materials also have incorporated water. So if you only dry the fuel and you still have material in there that has water, then you have to worry about that material generating hydrogen, which down the road could not allow you to transport it off-site. So again, this is kind of the thinking that the board is doing as it's doing its review. Yes, in the revised slide, it's much cleaner. Sorry it's so busy. But to Savannah River's credit, they did an assessment in 2011 and said, the L Basin is old. And like Kathy said, when a building is not safe and it's decommissioned, they'll take activity to bring the stack down. Well, when you have an operating facility, one of the things you do is you complete an assessment of, if I want to use this facility for another 40 to 50 years, what activities do I need to take now to make sure that it lasts 40 or 50 years more? And so DOE concluded that the L Basin could be used for another 50 years, providing that their existing surveillance and maintenance program, water chemistry, again, controlling that water chemistry is very important so that the aluminum-based fuels don't corrode. And so continue that program. But Savannah River also identified that there was an augmenting monitoring and condition assessment project that needed to occur. And that needed to be completed so that they would have confidence that the 50 years would work. Again, on mine, when I think it was split out, but basically what the board identified in 2015 was those augmented activities had not been completed, and some of them need to be done periodically. And so this was something that the board pointed out in its letter. And the last two slides of the backup has an excerpt from that letter by Rod Ewing representing the board's comments to DOE. And the board also identified, in addition to what Savannah River and Sindelar and Dibble in 2011 had identified, the board expressed opinion that more data needed to be gathered to support the technical basis for continuing. And it was primarily focused on concrete aging. Similar to what Susan Corbett had said, how do you know how well that concrete's lasting? And so the board suggested there were some other things that needed to be done. So as a part of its review, the board really identified three main issues. And again, the board is looking at it. The spent fuel is at Idaho, Savannah River, and Hanford. What needs to be done now at those places so that when it's time to package and transport, it can be. So managing the aging of the spent fuel and the facilities in which it's stored is a critical thing to be doing now. If you don't know where it's going to a repository, there's something you need to be doing now. As I suggested earlier, the DOE standardized canister is the canister that is the multi-purpose canister that DOE had identified would use throughout for all the remaining fuel that it needs to package. And finally, we identified that there's some disposal-related research of DOE spent fuel degradation processes if DOE continues generic repository research. So let me spend a little bit of a couple, I think 2 slides maybe. Yeah, 2 slides on aging management. So Hanford already has its fuel in a multi-purpose canister. It was only designed for 40 years. It's probably going to be in that canister for longer than 40 years before it actually gets to a repository. Well, if you've only designed it for 40 years, you better think about how to manage that so that you can use it in year 60 or 70 or whatever that year is. So the fuel will be stored decades longer than previously expected. So, as I said, at Hanford, it's already in multi-purpose canister. And the DOE spent fuel is much more degraded than commercial spent fuel, which makes it harder to manage its aging. The other thing that DOE has as a challenge is its wide diversity of fuel types and storage conditions. So each of these different types of fuel compounds, react differently under different atmospheres, environments. Some are stable in water, some are stable in dry atmospheres. And I'm not going to really go into it, but each of these materials, for example, different materials, carbon steel corrodes very rapidly, stainless steel, like in your sink, you don't get rust marks. So each of those types of materials that you're using to storage impacts what activities you might need to do to make sure that those materials are still safe and sound during the storage. So moving on to aging management. I talked a little bit earlier about aluminum-based fuel, and here's a figure where you can see these, what I call rust bubbles, or corrosion marks. And again, those corrosion materials absorb water internally, and so when you transfer that fuel into some package, like a drying apparatus like this, you're not just transferring the water that's dripping off the fuel, but the water that's been incorporated into the fuel. So the board basically noted or stated that it's essential to manage the spent fuel right now in a manner that will not impede its eventual disposal. And it's also important to improve understanding of processes related to packaging and storing that could affect transportation and disposal activities. And again, one of the key drivers that the board identified was the U.S. nuclear regulatory requirement for transportation packages. Under law, all spent fuel and high-level waste must be transported in an NRC-certified transportation package, which means NRC has the final say of whether it's safe to transport from where the fuel is now, Savannah River, to a repository. And so the board looked at what is the tightest constraint on DOE's management. It turns out it's the transportation, and drying is one of the things that is very important. This is from Idaho National Lab, just one of the ways you can dry fuel. So now I'm going to move into the board's recommendations and findings and recommendations. So, and I now know that the following slides after this, I pulled out a lot of the recommendation and put them in the backup, but that's all right. I can talk to it anyway. So the board found that the aging management programs are not fully implemented. Either the assessments are missing. That's not true for Savannah River, but it's true at Idaho and for one of the facilities at Hanford. Or there's an incomplete implementation. And again, Savannah River is ahead of the curve because they've done the assessment, but they're a little bit behind the curve because they haven't actually implemented some of the things that they've identified that they need to do. So the board recommended that DOE develop and fully implement the programs to manage degradation of spent fuel, the materials that contain it, like the L basin concrete, make sure that that's going to last, and the facilities itself. Because if people have ever gone into the L Basin, there are racks up above that are necessary to move the fuel around. So it's not just what the fuel is or what it's actually stored in, but the whole functionality of the facility has to be maintained until it's packaged. So, well, it's not in a backup slide anymore. So the board tends to be somewhat, I won't say verbose, but laid out very specifically the things that that the board thought the DOE should consider. And so again, because DOE has this issue of having a diversity, they've got a harder problem. It's just, they can't just take the solution right off the commercial vendor's shelf. That DOE needs to think about that these containers of storage operations, we don't know when that would be packaged, so manage these for many additional decades. In the report, the board identified a bunch of documents. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission is now contemplating extending nuclear reactors out to 80 years. So they've looked at aging of a lot of different materials that are in reactors, much broader spectrum of materials than just for dry storage. And so the board identified a bunch of places where DOE could go and say, if I wanted to develop an aging management program for carbon steel, well, here's what I would do. And that would be kind of the state-of-the-art approach to do. So the next place, I talked a little bit about the multi-canister overpack at Hanford, and that it was designed to allow monitoring during dry storage. And DOE wisely chose that approach because they didn't have a very big information basis to understand how dry they had dried the fuel. Because similarly, some of the fuels, like the aluminum-based fuel, there's not a lot of information about how dry it will be and how long, once it's packaged, it will be there before it gets disposed. The board thought it was important that measuring and monitoring the conditions of the spent fuel in these multi-purpose canisters is an important thing to do. So they basically recommended that. So when you develop a new facility, make sure the DOE standardized canister has the ability to measure those things, and make sure the facility where that canister is used can actually do the monitoring. And in terms of facility design, it's not a huge deal, but it's something that to be considered as you design that facility. The board found that an approved technical basis is needed for the proposed drying procedures for DOE before packaging it in multi-purpose canisters. So know what you need to do before you actually do it. And again, the combustibility is the hydrogen constraint that the Nuclear Regulatory Commission puts on transporting packages, but also pressurization and corrosion, because these canisters can corrode from the inside out if there's too much water left in there potentially. And so the board recommended these things, make sure it doesn't exceed the design specifications or the applicable operational regulatory requirements. And this period of interest extends over the duration of the canister use. So don't think about it just being stored at Savannah River, but if it's going to be stored at Savannah River for 30 years and then get transported and then stored again for another 30 years at a repository before it goes underground, then think about how long you have to manage that canister, where that canister is the barrier from the radionuclides reaching the workers and the public. So again, the board was pretty specific on what DOE's R&D efforts should entail. Again, one of the focus is aluminum-based fuel, focus on the water that's in those rust particles, so to speak. We identified that on the commercial side, the DOE and in fact, it's down the road up at South Carolina, DOE has a drying vacuum chamber that they're using to see how effectively they're drying commercial spent fuel. And so basically the board said, hey, DOE, EM, think about that facility up there. Is there any way that Savannah River or someone else can use that facility to help your own process of figuring out how dry is dry enough? Collect data on the potential hydrogen generation so that you know how much could be in the packages. And remember that you're not just putting fuel into these packages, you're putting in these neutron absorbers, which have water in them, so you actually need to know how much water there's going to be and how much hydrogen will be generated. So every type of material has a different rate of generation of hydrogen when impacted by radiation. I'll skip with the last two in the interest of time and keeping time for questions. So Hanford, Idaho, and Savannah River will have packaging facilities, at least in DOE's designs, that would package that spent fuel, that non-naval spent fuel, into the standardized canister for transport off-site. Idaho is the one that's closest to implementing a packaging facility, so this recommendation is focused on Idaho. But basically it says, complete the R&D, make sure that you've got regulatory approval before you finish the design of the packaging facility, because that could constrain some of the operations you might actually have to do in that packaging facility. So don't go too far down designing a facility only to try to get approval down the road, and the regulator says, well, you need to do that, and then you have to go back and have an upset in developing the packaging facility. So again, these are some of the things that the board identified, and DOE knows what these things are. So this is not new to DOE, but basically they would complete some remote welding and making sure the welds are good. They actually haven't completed this, which is this advanced neutron absorber. In fact, this was something that only came out as part of the review of the Yucca Mountain license application. Move on. Again, as I said, the board likes to really identify very specifically what DOE should be doing. Again, that's our job. Our job is to evaluate the scientific and technical validity and kind of identify for DOE, here are the things to do. Now, they might know that, but Congress might not know that. And so, again, we report both to the Secretary of Energy and to Congress. And so while some of this is old hat for DOE, it might be quite new for Congress. And so, again, we have to think about both audiences as we write our reports and recommendations. And so in the report, we talk about how the Navy handles its fuel. So the Navy kind of does it holistically. It says, okay, we're going to have this multi-purpose canister, and we're going to have a transportation package. So let's get the approval of the NRC, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, early on before we start using these. And so they kind of say, here are all the steps that need to be done, and they do those steps, and then they implement. And so this is kind of, again, for the standardized canister, DOE had never really identified how it would be transported. They had a vague recollection back in 2001. But these things matter, because if you do something and it can't be transported, that's an issue. So anyway, again, this is the kind of flavor that the board puts into its recommendations. This last one is not relevant to Savannah River site, but it is relevant to DOE EM. So the way it worked is, you would like to, if DOE EM did something with their spent fuel or high-level waste, they would like to have confidence that it could be disposed. Well, the Office of Civilian Radioactive Waste Management basically wrote memorandums of understanding between itself, the person who would actually dispose of the waste, and what are called waste custodians. So the Navy and DOE EM are the waste custodians. In other words, they have the waste now. So but they agreed between the Office of Civilian Radioactive Waste, if you do these things, then we'll accept it. And that could provide confidence for EM that once they did those things, that then they could be accepted into the waste management system. Well, it turns out that there's another DOE organization, Office of Nuclear Energy, that is not subject to a memorandum of agreement and is not subject to these waste acceptance system requirements, but is managing spent fuel and creating high-level waste forms. And so the board basically said, to have some more confidence that those waste forms that you're creating and the fuel that you have now will be disposable, just follow those things and keep the record of what you're doing. And finally, the board found that the diversity, again, of the chemical nature of these fuels, combined with the differences in the physical and chemical characteristics of different disposal environments complicates the disposal of DOE spent fuel. So I basically recommended if DOE continues to investigate a range of repository environments, then DOE should identify and prioritize its efforts concerning DOE spent fuel and how it degrades in those environments for each of those host environments. I think I might have one more slide. Okay. And this is just, again, a little bit more. I won't spend any time on it, but basically, as the fuel degrades in different repository environments, it could cause gas generation, which is something at Yucca Mountain that DOE considered and removed from its consideration because Yucca Mountain is in an unsaturated environment and moves, so there's no potential for gas accumulation. So I think with that, I'm ready for questions.
Okay. So if you look at the agenda and you look at the clock, you might be under the mistaken impression that we've only got 10 minutes for questions, and that's not true. I've spoken with DOE and the executive board and with Brett, and we've all agreed that we're going to keep going until you guys have exhausted all the questions you have for Brett. So with that in mind, I am going to ask, though, that you still keep to the 2 questions at a time limit, and then we'll go around. And the reason is because when you get to 3, 4, 5 questions, it turns into a conversation between you and the presenter, and the rest of the board tunes out. So let's keep everybody engaged. Let's do 2 questions. We'll go around, and if you still got questions, we'll come back, okay? So with that, I know that I saw Susan's card first, so we're going to give Susan the first shot at it.
Susan Corbett, CAB, thank you. This is probably, in my opinion, the hottest topic in the whole nuclear industry, the canisters. It's so critical, and I know this is about DOE. Is there a publication about, does this apply to commercial as well, or do you have a separate publication for that?
Yeah, this report was looking solely at the DOE spent fuel and the canisters. We relied on what the Nuclear Regulatory Commission is looking on the commercial canisters, but that was not subject of our review. So they've identified certain things that you would want to do for the commercial canisters in terms of inspections and material degradation. That's, we reference that, but we did not review the commercial side.
So this multi-purpose canister that they reference in here, this is something that you envision as like a cradle to grave kind of canister that would, you know, is that, or is it going to have to be repackaged? And my question then is it monitored for leaks? And how do you know after transportation across our bumpy rail system, do you haven't damaged the fuel? Is there an inspection at the end? And I have lots of questions about this.
That's a great leading question. And one of the things that I want to point out is that the board, like this body, webcasts its meeting. And in June, we're going to be talking about the technical issues associated with transportation per se. And so that's going to be held up in Idaho. Can you repeat your question one more time real quick?
Well, then we can just move on to something else, because
Okay.
I'm going to get this report. Last thing, I think the picture you had in here is with the bubbles. Is that hydride buildup?
It's not hydride. It's aluminum corrosion products. It's pitting corrosion. And this fuel actually, I think, was from South America, where the water chemistry wasn't held very well, and the aluminum started to corrode, and that's what that is.
But the point is once you start getting hydrogen in a canister, it can combust.
And
correct?
That's the reason why, yes, why the hydrogen limit is less than 4%, and that's the critical point.
And drying is so important to make sure that we don't have any way for there to be hydrogen buildup in the canister.
Or an acceptable level of hydrogen buildup.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Let's go counterclockwise this time, so let's go to Dawn.
Dawn Gillis, CAB. You said we had as much time as we need. Is that like 3 days?
So, what do you want to do?
So based on that, we're going to be bringing this back up at the Nuclear Materials Committee meeting, right?
As board members. Brett will not be there for that, so you guys
okay,
will be.
you won't be there for that. Okay.
So get your questions out now.
All right. So where do I start? I want to go to the canisters as well. The drying, all of the issues you brought up here with the drying and monitoring and how long and all this kind of stuff has been one of my major sticking points for trying to do dry storage now, especially of SRS fuel. As long as we can manage the wet storage, there's already been was $1 billion plus to try to put it into dry storage as the the top of the, look-see to see what it would take to put our aluminum fuel?
Maxine Max at DOE. Yes, we have an estimate for what we think it would take to get to dry storage, but as we've said before, there's a lot of research that we have to do, so those costs are not included in that estimate, so it's only going to go higher.
And it costs about $40 million a year at this point to manage it in its current form.
L Basin
L
runs
Basin.
between $40 to $50 million a year.
Okay,
Yes.
and to do the augmented surveillance of the canyon, not the canyon, the basin, what has not, this was a question that I actually had for Maxine. Have I gotten over my 2-question limit yet? What are those things that were mentioned here that were not implemented, that need to be implemented in the basin?
So there's we call it AMCAP, Augmented Monitoring Condition Assessment Program. It's very varied. There's lots of pieces. There are periodic pieces, which is one of them is water quality, which we do continuously. There's other pieces of the concrete where we took core bores out of C reactor, which was done at the exact same time with the same concrete. We did that analysis in the lab. There's the fuel inspection piece. That's the piece that has not been done yet, where we have the fuel inspection table now that you can go in, you can take videos, it has measurements on it, so you can get an exact replica from when you look at a fuel today versus looking at it next year or the year after, so you can actually do that comparison of degradation. We've had pictures, but there's no way to go back and actually analyze any degradation because there were no rulers, there was no way to confirm there was degradation. So we now have that table. It is installed in El Basin. We have not started those fuel inspections yet. That hopefully will be coming next year.
Okay, so the fuels that you're taking out and taking over to the canyon at this point to process, are you inspecting that towards this purpose at all?
No, the fuels that are going to H Canyon are still in their bundles, the overall bundle.
Yep.
That just gets taken to the canyon and disposed of, where you actually dissolve it into its integral parts.
And you're never actually looking at the fuel surface itself. Okay, that's true.
No, you see the bundle itself, which is made out of aluminum, and we do monitor for that. We also have coupons of different aluminum and different fuel types, materials, not the fuel itself, but coupons that we monitor on a yearly basis, and the lab does sample analysis on all of those for us as well.
Okay.
Forgot to mention is that in May you're going to be getting the DOE perspective on the spent nuclear fuel program. So Maxine will be in front of us. And I know that you hate when I say let's be patient, but in May they're going to come back. The department's going to come back.
All right, can I do one more topic here real quick?
Let's come back around. Okay. Let's give Brendan a chance to...
So I want to kind of amplify something that Don said. The board didn't make a recommendation to put fuel in dry storage. It just said, understand your drying procedures and all the materials that will go in there, because that's going to inform, how long you want to put it in storage, how dry it has to be. So again, I just, the board report was on all the facilities, and it wasn't necessarily just on Savannah River, but I wanted to clarify that the board wasn't saying put it into dry storage, but once you package it, you have to consider how long that package will be in use before it's actually disposed.
And if that package would be acceptable 40, 50, 60 years from now, because just because people have an agreement now that says it can be, most of us are going to be dead and gone before anything actually happens with this stuff. So, all right.
I promise. Doug?
Doug Howard Cap. Sir, the lack of progress that you've listed in the issues that you've shown us today, do you see that as being a funding problem or a technical or political problem?
So we focus on the technical and scientific, and people often ask us if we focus on the money problem. We don't. We can acknowledge that DOE has said it's a funding problem, for instance, in the augmented inspection program, that they literally just haven't gotten the funding to do it. Regarding anything else, that's, the law is the law, and when Congress decides to appropriate money on programs, that determines what DOE is doing.
And the last question I have, is any of your report classified?
No, not at all.
Thank you.
It's all free and public.
Greg.
Thank you, Brett, for the presentation today. I just have a quick question. What is it your board would like our board to do with this information?
I don't think we had thought about that. It was primarily, I mean, our job is to provide information that's accessible to the public, Congress, and Secretary of Energy. I don't think we were looking for any action, but we felt it was important that the board had undertaken this review, and we wanted to make sure that if you guys were interested in our review from an independent technical review aspect, that the information was available for you to deal with however you see fit.
Larry Powell, Cap. How would you prioritize the geologic repository in the overall scheme of things in your committee?
I'm not sure I quite get the...
You talk a lot about the movement of spent nuclear fuel and the processing and storage of spent nuclear fuel. Without a geologic repository, it would seem that most of these comments are moot. Where do you put the repository on your list of things that are needed to be looked at?
Well, certainly you're not going to transport it if you don't have a destination. And from the DOE spent fuel side, it's not clear that interim storage offsite is anything that DOE is actively pursuing. So it's more about that, you know, parts of DOE are moving ahead, like the Navy is moving ahead with this big canister and has gone through this process. And I guess the board's point on the DOE standardized canister is DOE EM, there's not a technical reason why you couldn't move forward on developing this and deploying it when you need it. What has happened now is DOE has said, we're not going to do anything on this. And because there are long lead times associated with doing these things, that's basically the reason why the board suggested you start doing the R&D necessary to complete it. So it's not like you can, you know, make the decision on a repository there tomorrow, but in an efficiency standpoint, if you know you need to do these things and there's no downside because any repository could accommodate the DOE standardized canister, then it kind of makes sense to do these upfront things now.
I understand, thank you. And one final question. In your key observations on SRS, you say that DOE plans to indefinitely suspend its decision on the planned exchange of spent nuclear fuel with Idaho. In the process of explaining that, you said that the non-aluminum clad fuels could not be processed in H Canyon. I'm kind of wondering why they're here to begin with if they couldn't be processed in H Canyon.
I'm going to defer that to DOE. I don't think I have as deep a background on the history of how the fuel got there. Thank you, Maxine.
Maxine Max at DOE. I don't know the exact reasoning, but it was a long time ago. Some of these fuels are 50 years old, so those decisions were made way before there was a regionalization between aluminum and non-aluminum going to Idaho. So it's just from the history of the site. Some of it is actually some site fuel from the Hector reactor, the test reactor we had. It had stainless and zirc in it as well. So some of it was our own material.
Thank you, Maxine. That's all.
Dan?
Thanks, Larry, for the question. You got one of mine. Appreciate it. Thank you very much for coming in. We've been excited to learn of your presentation, and we had a lot of anticipation. I know I did as much background as I possibly could squeeze in when I got the documents. So kind of cutting to the chase from a layman's point of view, since I'm not a technical expert, what does your board see as the #1 concern for SRS with regards to spent nuclear fuel?
Understanding how to dry all the material, aluminum-based fuel and those advanced neutron absorbers, so that when they need to implement the technology, they're ready to do it.
Thank you.
Okay. Susan, let's come back.
Susan Corbett, CAB. So this multi-purpose, you mentioned a multi-purpose canister in here.
Correct.
Is this the one that you reference would have to last 50, 60 years?
Yes.
Okay, but does that mean it lasts 50 to 60 years from when it's first loaded from either a DOE facility or a commercial facility until it goes into the permanent repository, and then, or is it going to be repackaged at some point into some? Okay, so okay, ask that first.
So when I say 50 to 60 years, that thin-walled stainless steel canister is the primary barrier for release of radionuclides. When it gets to a repository, it gets a thick waste package overpack, and reliance on radiation safety is no longer on that thin wall, but on the waste package overpack. So it's really from the day it's deployed until it's got another permanent barrier on the outside.
Okay,
the
so
idea is that thin-walled container is never opened up and the spent fuel is never handled again.
It's repackaged at the permanent repository.
Correct.
Okay, second question. So this cast, this thin wall cast that's inside, is it built to be monitored and repackaged if necessary if you determine in that interim previous period that it has a crack, that somehow the fuel was damaged either when it went in or as it was is there any way, is this at all monitorable, and are there ways to repackage it? Because you wouldn't want to put something that was damaged or leaking into the overpack, into the permanent repository, would you?
Well, the fuel is already damaged. So most of the fuel the Hanford fuel was completely damaged. Most of it was damaged when it went into those multi-purpose canisters. So the fuel itself is not a barrier for release. In fact, DOE made the assumption for disposal that all the fuel dissolves instantaneously.
Right.
Okay, so the fuel is not a barrier. DOE also took no credit for that interior multi-purpose canister as a barrier. What they did take credit for is that waste package overpack of corrosion resistance material.
So that's not monitorable, though. Once it's in there, it's sealed, and you don't know after that what's going on in there.
So that's why the one recommendation, if DOE deploys the standardized canister, they had a design option that it could be monitored during storage. The board recommended that. And again, and that was the idea of how long is it going to be? How good is your knowledge base that you understood how hydrogen is generating over time, how well you've dried it? Now, you could offset the monitoring if you had a very robust data base for understanding all those processes, but there are a lot of, uncertainties.
Have you guys developed a set of criteria for these casts, these 50 to 60? I mean, or anything? Is this kind of what you're expecting? Is it in here what you're looking for in terms of the quality of the cask and how they're handled?
We review what DOE has done, and so we don't say go pick this can or anything.
But ultimately, the NRC is responsible for this, right? They are responsible for the canisters,
right, when they get
the canister design.
That's right. So for example, the Department of Energy was going to rely on those canisters not leaking during transportation, during a hypothetical accident condition. Now, that's why it's important for DOE to go through that process, because NRC could say, well, you're going to need to do this and this and this to make sure we have enough, sufficient information and confidence that it won't leak. So.
Okay. All right.
Dawn Gillis, Cab. I'll just go through one more of my contention points is the Idaho's SRS swap. This is something that's been on the table for decades. It's something that was approved back in the, 06, 07 time frame and got killed in the 08, 09 time frame. Back in that 06, 07 time frame, there was a plan that was approved all the way up. It just never got implemented. That would have had us out of the basin by next year. And that did not happen. And a large part of that was based on getting the non-aluminum fuel to Idaho and running the canyon continuously to get the aluminum fuels out, et cetera. So seeing the indefinite suspension, I know that there have been talks again about the possibility of reinstituting that, and I've been threatening to do a recommendation on that. I just haven't. This is going to give me that kick in the butt to go do that. But this is one of those things that I think is so important to help us get out of the basin, because that's not going to be a short-term task. And I think I don't know if the board has actually looked at what it will physically take, or if that's even in your charter, to look at what it physically take to get all those old, degraded, many forms of non-aluminum fuels out of our basin alone, even if we had a place to send it.
So I like how you put the context on it. The board is supposed to do an ongoing review. That's what Congress expects. Mm-hmm. You can think of this spent fuel report as laying out the landscape, okay, of the things that the board would follow. And so we're looking at, to the extent that we can, what DOE is planning. So DOE has a spent fuel working group that has representatives of all the senior managers of all the organizations, not just EM and NE and Navy, but Office of Science and all the other ones that have spent fuel. One of the things that they've been working on is a draft strategy for managing all their spent fuel. Now, I know it was under development. I recently heard that it might not be under development anymore. And so to the extent that the board and DOE allows us to look at those things, the board could look at those things. We're just in the process of still rolling out this report, but I think my colleague back there has taken notes on something else the board could look at.
Yeah, so what can we, as the Citizens Advisory Board for Savannah River Site, do to help get that onto your, whatever the right word is, charter, workplate, whatever?
Radar. Yes. It's on our radar now.
Okay.
And your comments are helpful.
Okay, thank you.
All
I'll let us go to lunch now.
Any more questions for Brett? You sure? Going once? Going twice? All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So we're only a little bit over. So let's do this. Let's just round up to it being 11:15 and ask everybody to come back at 12:45. Oh, and Doug has an announcement first.
Anyone who wants to come, Mellow Mushroom on Broad is where we're going to eat some lunch. Fellowship.
All right.
Eat.
So Doug's going to the Mellow Mushroom. Anybody wants to tag along?
Yeah.
You can feel free. If not, we'll see you at 12:45. Thank you, everyone.
I don't think so.